Is my worldview better than yours? A couple of weeks ago, I posted a video in which I raised the question of how you might go about evaluating your own or someone else's worldview. There's surely a sense in which we think that our own worldview is right in a way that others simply aren't. If we thought another worldview was better, we would surely adopt it. I suggested that one criterion by which we might judge whether our particular worldview is better than another is by how well it corresponds with observed reality. This is a kind of empirical approach, I suppose, although I suggest it has very little actually to do with how we arrive at a particular worldview or evaluate others. But that's another story. In a comment on that video, one of my viewers, Wolfram Hart, wrote, "You bring up the idea that the superiority of a worldview may be measured by its accuracy in corresponding to reality. But then you sort of hint that there may be other metrics of determining the quality of a worldview beyond this. I thought that was an interesting idea and wondered if you could think of any examples of other ways one may determine the superiority of one worldview over another." This is an interesting comment. Thanks, Wolfram Hart. And it certainly got me thinking. Again, when we're considering philosophical questions, we always seem to get pushed back down to a deeper level. When we answer one question, it opens up a whole lot of other questions. I would suggest that this is actually the same in science. Will we ever get to the point in either discipline when we come to the end of questioning? Will we, in fact, finally get to the bottom of things? Who knows? I think there's a reluctance these days to pursue the more speculative philosophical questions. They're seen as useless. How many universities these days even actually have a faculty of philosophy? And if they do, to what extent do they pursue these kinds of speculative questions? I suspect not many and not much, except perhaps to debunk them, really. Which, of course, represents a particular worldview, one in which usefulness is an overriding criterion, which, at an even more basic level, probably means economically valuable. Will it make money? Or, more generously, will it bring about better conditions in the world, a greater good? Will it have practical applications? Of course, unless we pursue speculative philosophy and ask the difficult, apparently useless questions, we won't have the skills to challenge this worldview. Maybe that's the point. Avoiding difficult philosophical questions is a way that our current worldview tries to protect itself. Also, I think it's just too damn hard for most people. And it is difficult. It's as difficult as quantum physics, and leads into very fuzzy areas that are equally difficult to conceptualize. Concerning the precise question that Wolfram Hart posed, this pushed me back to two prior questions. The first was, where does my particular worldview come from? The second was, what do we mean by better anyway? It's the second question that I want to consider today, and I'm pretty sure you won't find any definitive answer here. So much of philosophy actually comes down to how we understand words. It seems to me that people argue about concepts, often to the point of violence, because they don't even share a common language. They're talking at cross purposes. They're talking past each other. The same word means different things to different people, and even different things to the same person at different times and in different contexts. So perhaps it's not surprising that much of more recent philosophy seems to have been reduced to linguistics. What do we mean by better? Surely we have to make some attempt to understand this question before we can answer the question, is my worldview better than yours? And let's be clear, that question is not just about wanting to prove I'm right and you're wrong, or at least it shouldn't be. It's actually about what is the best way of living in the world. which it seems to me is about survival. Maybe not only that, but certainly that among other things. In a way, I've already partly answered the question, haven't I? A better worldview is one which serves most effectively to ensure the survival of the human race. But of course that can be pushed back a step further. That the survival of the human race is worth fighting for already reflects a worldview. Polar bears might not feel the same way. Syrians from the Dog Star might not feel the same way. God may not feel the same way. Also, perhaps mere survival is not the best of goals. Certainly not the only goal. But back to better. How do we actually use this word? Well, let's consider two paintings. We might argue that painting A is better than painting B because the artist demonstrates a greater level of skill and technique. This, of course, already presupposes that skill and technique are somehow more important than expression and intention. Will this never end? So we've used certain criteria to claim that one painting is better than another. But what if A and B are actually by the same artist and roughly from the same period of their life? In this case, the same level of skill and technique might be expected in both paintings. I suppose it's still possible that the execution is better in one painting than the other, and we might claim to be judging the painting on this basis. But let's suppose that both paintings are equally well executed, demonstrating the same level of skill. I suggest that we might still prefer one over the other. Perhaps there's something in our own life that makes one painting resonate with us more than the other. Perhaps one painting expresses our own values more than the other. Note now, though, that our language has changed. I couldn't bring myself to say that, in these circumstances, one painting is objectively better than the other. I had to start saying that I preferred one over the other. This became a personal, subjective assessment rather than some kind of objective assessment. This assessment arises out of our own history, our personal experience, our personal taste, and our value system. Things that are within us rather than in the object we're considering. Could this be what we mean, or at least part of what we mean, by one worldview being better than another? Are we just expressing a personal preference? If this is the case, then we certainly need to be careful to distinguish this from some kind of objective evaluation. So maybe this is a first step in evaluating and comparing different worldviews. Is it based on objective criteria or subjective experience? As is often the case, I find with questions like this that self-examination and self-awareness are critical to the process. Maybe I just like my worldview more than I like yours. Now let's ask a different question. Is a polar bear better than an ant? Comparing apples and oranges, I suppose, but let's pursue the question a little further anyway. First of all, both of these types of animals are the endpoints of a long process of natural selection. They're at the leading edge of the evolutionary process that has led to their existence. In that sense, they are, or have been at least, the fittest of their respective lines, the best suited to survival. But, you have to add, under certain conditions. Polar bears are ideally suited to living in polar conditions. Ants, not so much. Ants survive well under desert conditions. Some ants, anyway. Polar bears, not so much. Also, different kinds of animals are better at some things than other kinds of animals. Storks, for example, are good at building nests on power pylons. Elephants, not so much. Of course, elephants don't need to build nests on top of power pylons, unless, of course, you're Horton. Some animals are better at surviving the impact of human beings on the planet than others. So, there are 2 points I want to make here. First, Animal A can be better than animal B at some things, but not at others. Here our language has changed slightly again. Not just better, but better at. There's no reason to argue that a stork is, in some universal sense, better than an elephant. We need only say that it's better at building nests and flying, unless you're Dumbo. There are some very unusual elephants, apparently. Some animals are better in some settings than others. Ants are better adapted at living in the desert than polar bears. So, better is context dependent. It's circumstantial. When conditions change, as they do, for instance, due to human impact, an animal's specific adaptations, its strengths under the conditions under which it evolved, may become liabilities. So I go from there to ask, are some worldviews better than others in some ways, but worse in other ways? So, for example, are some worldviews better at providing structure and enforcing discipline than others, which might be useful in situations of danger and uncertainty? A bit like martial law or wartime government, which we may introduce at times of crisis. These worldviews have evolved under certain conditions to meet certain survival needs. Perhaps, on the other hand, some worldviews are more suited to times of change and flux. They're more responsive, more adaptable, more tolerant, whereas others are just too rigid to respond well or quickly to change. Like different types of animals, some worldviews may work better in some contexts than others. They've evolved to work in those contexts. So, perhaps as with animals, it's not as simple as one worldview being better than another worldview. It may be better at some things and under some conditions, and worse at some things and worse under some conditions. Perhaps we may sometimes be able to borrow between cultures, and I think that does happen, though it can be a slow and painful process. Each culture probably has inbuilt defensive mechanisms. Also, hybridizations won't always work. I can't see an ant-polar bear hybrid surviving well in either habitat. So, does any of this help to answer the question, how do I decide whether one worldview is better than another? Maybe not, but maybe questioning the question is not a bad place to start.